Hi, I'm Addison K, Witt, Poet Laureate of the Defense of Democracy and host of this podcast. The attack on America's public school system isn't slowing down, but neither are we. Here you'll meet authors, educators, students, and defenders from across the country who aren't just sounding the alarm, they're answering it. You'll be informed, you'll be moved, and if we've done our job right, you'll be ready to stand with us. This is the Defense of Democracy podcast. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome to Rise, the Defense of Democracy podcast, where we explore the people, ideas, and voices working to strengthen democracy at every level of society. I'm your host, Addison K. Witt. Today's conversation will focus on immigration policy and its impact on children and families. I'm joined by Suma Setty and Kaelin Rapport, who bring insight and experience to the urgent realities facing vulnerable families and to the policies shaping their futures. Today, we hope to talk about what's happening, what's being misunderstood, and why compassion, clarity, and action matter now more than ever. Please welcome Suma Setty and Kaelin Rapport. Hello, and welcome to Rise Podcast. How are you doing today?
Hi, thank you so much for welcoming us.
It's a pleasure to have you here. For those meeting you for the very first time, tell us a little bit more about who you are and the work that you're most passionate about right now.
Sure, I can go first. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for Law and Social Policy, and I lead the research portfolio on the Immigration and Immigrant Families team. I also co-lead the Children Thrive Action Network. This is a coalition of anti-poverty organizations, also pro-kid and pro-immigrant organizations that all work together to advocate on behalf of children in mixed status families or children in immigrant families. I co-lead the research working group. I tell people that I identify as a researcher sun, an advocate rising, and a wannabe revolutionary moon. But basically, I have over a decade of experience conducting community-centered qualitative research to understand how policy directly impacts families with children and understanding what policy solutions can be formulated to meet their needs.
Wow, that is a mouthful for sure. And I'm curious, what drew you to that work specifically?
I am a little bit, I've kind of gone through a wide-ranging career trajectory, pretty non-traditional. I graduated during the Great Recession, and so I was just taking jobs wherever I could find them. And I started out in, buying a one-way ticket to DC, really idealistic young person, just trying to figure out how I could help, right? How can I make this country a better place? But basically, I was consistently disappointed by people in power is what happened. And I ended up doing the whole young person thing and traveling the world and trying to figure out what my strengths are and how I can plug in to the movement. And I happened to stumble upon a job after graduate school where I learned that my little research and analysis skills and my computer tapping, it can be part of something that can really change people's lives. The moment I really felt inspired to do more policy work was when I realized some analyses that I had contributed helped move the needle to make Cincinnati expand free pre-K and their state earned income tax credit. I learned that approximately 6,000 children in Cincinnati were able to benefit from this. And I think that's when I was like, oh, okay, this can make a difference.
And you found a lane that works for you. Good for you. That journey, sometimes it takes us left, takes us right, and then before we know it, it was preparing us all the while for the work that would oftentimes become most important. Kaelin, tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to the work that you do.
Sure. So my name is Kaelin Rapport. I'm a policy analyst on the Public Benefits Justice team and the Racial Equity team at CLASP. I hold a PhD in cultural anthropology, And I've been using a research to trying to elevate the voices of marginalized communities for several years now. That's sort of what I've been doing, and also what sort of led me to this work. Um, Even though I've worked across several different subject areas, right? Looking into the health impacts of incarceration on Black communities in Milwaukee, as well as the mental health impacts of being I'm a DACA recipient in a mixed status family in Maryland. Um, even before that, how to identify the skeletal remains, or like various methods of identifying skeletonized remains. The through line has sort of been health disparities and the social and political sort of factors, right, that determine who becomes sick and more frequently, right? And so that work led me to CLASP, because after grad school, I saw this application for a policy analyst position that was looking for someone to investigate the historical sort of foundations of policies that were inequitable, right? And so this seemed like a perfect opportunity to use my skill set to try and materially benefit people's lives right now.
How would you encapsulate the mission behind your current work on immigration and policy and family well-being?
Families are stressed, families are sick, and families are being beaten down by a government that is intentionally making the American dream, right, far out of the reach of most people who live in the United States. And that's especially so for children, immigrant families, right? Like children in general are a very vulnerable population. They can't vote. Many times they can't articulate how they're feeling, right? And yet they're also bearing the brunt of the policies and practices of immigration and enforcement, right? And so that's why we at CLASP were very interested in learning more about what's happening to these immigrant children, right? In this, like children, in this generation, they're being set back there's a cross generational impact that's happening. And so I think that's sort of how we want to encapsulate this.
As you're talking about this, and you mentioned that children and families are beat down, I went to my own upbringing and thought about a lot of cultural activities that are often referred to. We ran around without shoes. We could play outside until the sun came down, and our parents didn't worry about us, and they would call out, "Come home!" And everyone would scatter and run home, or whatever the case may be. And you often hear people, particularly from my generation, talk about what that was like, drinking water from an outdoors water hose. These were very innocent times, and yet there were still challenges in the world, right? There were still disparities and inconsistencies and all the isms that we are familiar with today. When you talk about that beating down of children today, what are some of the shared realities that children and families are dealing with? We know that it's hard and rough, but can you give us some examples of what people are actually facing collectively?
We have a lot of stories that we could draw from. The main thing that I would want to say is that the way that people have access to public space is almost radically different, right? Since January 2025, people are scared to leave their homes to go grocery shopping. They're scared to take their kids to school. They're scared to go to work. They're scared to go to the hospital or a health clinic for like regular checkups, right? And so all of these, there's this major chilling effect that's happening in regard to people's mobility, and like I was saying, their there's research that's tied to health improvements because you have a public park in your neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so that's one concrete example of people not having access to that park anymore for themselves or their children. Right. On top of, kids missing school or being enrolled in early education programs, that's not happening as much as it was before. And just, some of the examples that you have provided of people talking about how they grew up before, I think on top of that limitation on mobility is this isolation that people are feeling, right? Like where there may have been more of a sense of community. These current immigration policies and practices are making people feel very isolated. And so those feelings of being part of a village, right, or part of a community, in some ways, I think are drastically reduced.
And I just want to add to that, and I totally agree with Kaelin. I mean, both of us were co-leading this project to kind of document the impact of immigration policies on families with young children, so families with children ages 6 and under across the US. And between June and December of last year, we conducted interviews and focus groups in Colorado, Georgia, Illinois, Michigan, New Jersey, Texas, and Washington State to speak with immigrant parents in particular, and also to speak with folks who provide services to those families with young children, like early care and childcare providers, WIC staff, home visitors, healthcare providers. And so much of what we found was what Kaelin just mentioned, right? People are scared in their everyday lives. One of our reports were just released a couple of weeks ago. One of our reports is called "Even the Playground Isn't Safe," because we heard that over and over again, that people, like these public spaces, right, are no longer places of joy and community. They are places of fear because people are scared of being kidnapped by ICE agents and separated from their families and their communities and everything they've worked really hard to earn and thrive. And I think another thing is that we learned how I think all of us can relate to the high costs of living right now. Mm-hmm. Everything is more expensive, right? I was just buying spinach and I'm like, why am I paying this much for spinach? Was there something a memo that I didn't get? Just everyday small things like that. We are all being impacted. And then just imagine putting that shock of immigration enforcement into people's lives. That is something that is really scary for folks. People, before this administration, and we had some limitations to where ICE could go, where enforcement operations could happen. So there were restrictions on immigration enforcement at hospitals, at clinics, at schools, and at places of worship. And that all went away the first day of the Trump administration. They rescinded all of that. And that is something that is a reason why we see ICE everywhere. Children are seeing ICE, like masked agents with guns, outside of their classroom windows. That is not normal. That is scary. It doesn't matter if you're a child of an immigrant or if you're not, if everyone in the community is experiencing this.
Thank you for sharing some of the vulnerabilities and talking about the fear. I think it's really important because regardless of where you stand politically and which administration you support, I think there is something, and this has nothing to do with policy, but when you start talking about fear and entire communities that are subjected to degradation and lack of human equality, I always go to this place. Collectively, we as a people talk about we're all one, we're all united, we're all the same. I believe that. And I also believe that when we're talking about entire populations who are suffering, that has an impact on the whole, the we are one. And it has an impact in ways that when, for instance, I don't see ICE in their full gear. I don't see them in our community here. Yet that doesn't mean it's not existing, it's not happening, and there are people in other communities who are experiencing that, and it ultimately will have a ripple effect on all of our communities. Would you say that is accurate, or is that your framework and point of view, that we all are impacted by things that are happening in different communities, one way or another?
That's one of the main points that I think that we were trying to drive home with how we wrote the two reports, right? Like in that example that Suma had just shared, if a child sees one of their classmates' parents being taken while they're playing on the playground, they're also going to be fearful, right? Like they might not think first about their citizenship status and whether or not their parents can be harmed by that. They might just think that, like my parent might also be taken, right? Or having feelings of empathy for their fellow classmate, right? And we can also sort of zoom out from the individual or the community like lived experience to think about this, right? Like we spoke with people who are working in early childcare and education. That workforce sector is also being crushed right now by these immigration enforcement and policies, right? Like 1/5 of all folks in this workforce sector come from immigrant families themselves. So while they're having to show up and provide a fun and safe place for children to learn and thrive, right, they're also dealing with the same sort of fears and anxieties that their clients are their like children and the parents that they serve are also experiencing, on top of all the funding cuts, right, and some of the instability that came into play with the government shutdown, and the longest government shutdown in U.S. history last year. And as far as like the larger sort of economics are concerned, right? Like if people don't have childcare, then they're not going to be able to go to work themselves. And with immigrant communities and like individuals being more scared to participate in society, right? Like there's like an economic sort of a retraction, right, on the macro level. I think that we are and will continue to be dealing with.
And just to connect the dots a bit more, I just want to, like, absolutely right, Kaelin. Like this is impacting everybody, but in the early care provider space, like we're talking about, 1 in 5 early care educator is an immigrant themselves. They're foreign born. And so not only are we talking about their families and their children being impacted, their staff is being impacted too. We heard from Texas providers who said that they've been losing childcare staff because they're too scared to come to work. And we also heard about concerns about limits on work authorization for immigrants that is also preventing immigrant childcare workers being able to actually work because work permits are what is necessary for everyone to be able to work, right? Like decreased enrollment in people's centers and programs, feeling the loss of staff, and also staff morale. People are scared. Like we spoke with two providers in the Chicagoland area. And if you recall, in late fall of last year, there was Operation Midway Blitz in the Chicagoland area that involved a huge influx of ICE agents, armed ICE agents, into the city and in the surrounding areas. And there was actually a news story about how a childcare worker was dragged out of their childcare center in front of babies and toddlers and arrested. There's absolutely no reason that we're doing this other than to spread widespread fear and harm. And everyone in the community is impacted. Not only do, childcare providers and educators, they do so much more than babysitting. They are developing curriculum. This period of time in everybody's lives is incredibly important in terms of like the rest of their trajectory for their lives, right? And instead of being able to focus on the well-being of their children in their care, they're having to create protocols for lockdown procedures because armed agents might be outside the door. They're having to deal with people who are coming in and pretending to be ICE agents. They're having to deal with ICE agents just like coming in without showing any sort of ID.
Wow.
It's really easy to ignore this side of the experience just because our media cycle is moving so quickly and our brains can't retain all of this information, right? Like it's so easy to just move on to the next thing. But I think we need to really remember that these are children that we're talking about, and they have no idea what their immigration status is. They don't even know what immigration means. That's a really big word for babies and toddlers. They don't even know what country their family is from. They just know that they want to feel safe. And immigration enforcement is not making them feel safe.
I was just watching part of Defense of Democracy, we have a Defense of Democracy film festival, and I was just watching one of the films about Hiroshima and the bomb that went off Hiroshima, the bomb that went off, and children were impacted and affected, and talking about the loss and separation of their parents, and that feeling of isolation, incredible fear, uncertainty, not having parents that either understood what was going on or could guide them through that process, and the lifelong damage that does to the central nervous system, the lifelong damage it does to a person's psyche, the way they see themselves, the way they see the world. And we often say children are so resilient. They're so resilient. They bounce back very quickly. And I've come to a place where I don't believe that any longer. I believe they are storing information inside. They don't process it in the same way because they're so young and they don't have the tools and information yet. But that information is stored in their bodies. And as they mature as people, it rears its head, it comes back, and you have a lifetime of dealing with these challenges. What would you say are some of the common myths or misunderstandings people have about immigrant families and the systems affecting them? What are we not seeing, and what are myths that we believe are happening?
Yeah, but before I answer that question, I just want to touch upon something you said.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I was listening to your podcast a couple of episodes, and I remember you mentioning a book called The Body Keeps Count. And it's an excellent book, right? And it is
One of my faves. Body Keeps the Score.
A Body Keeps the Score. Thank you. Yes, that's what it's
Mm-hmm.
called. And one thing that's pretty clear from child development evidence is that trauma in early childhood can really impact the long-term outcomes for children. And it really, if you imagine a rubber band, right, and you keep it stretched out, it's like their stress response systems are constantly being activated. And at that young age, when their neurons are still developing, that can really that can make their stress response systems stay stagnant and stretch them out and stress them to the point where they can no longer stretch back and be elastic and be resilient, right? We shouldn't have to ask our children to be resilient when what they deserve is safety and protection. And I think that is why investments in early childcare is actually one of the most cost-effective investments that we as a society can do for the well-being of our future and for our current well-being as well. And to address your question about some of the myths, I think so many of the myths revolve um, around the immigration system itself. I don't think people understand how complex and difficult it is for many people to get legal status. My family is from India, and we directly benefited from the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which allowed high-skilled visas for high-skilled professionals to come to the U.S. And my father's a doctor. He came here on a work visa. And it was directly because of that policy, right? So these are policy choices that we can make as a country. Immigrants aren't coming in because they want to take, they're coming in because they want to work. There's so many quotes that we have from our study that centers on exactly that. People that we spoke with want others to know that they're here to work and to earn their way. And if there was a way for them to get legal status, they would do it. And they are trying. So many of them are trying, actually. But one thing that people need to understand is that even while you are trying to get legal status, you are subject to deportation because they're in a limbo state. So the term undocumented, in my opinion, is extremely misleading because the government does know about these people. There are documents that records everybody that's coming into this country. And it is a choice for them to separate families. And it is a choice for them to not put money into making that system better, but instead to kicking people out by violent force, right? So I think people need to keep in mind that our immigration system and policies and routes, there isn't a line. There is I would call it more of like a tangled web of yarn. Like, I don't know. I'll work on that metaphor, but
we get it. We get what you're saying.
Right. And it is easier for some people than others. And it is easier for people who are from certain countries. It's easier for people who are more educated. It's easier for people who are literate. The government is making asylum more difficult. So people who are running from danger and seeking safety in the US, it is making it more difficult for them. And so I think another thing that we've learned is that people are being apprehended when they are following the law, right? The government knows about folks who are applying for asylum, and they ask them to come in for check-ins, frequent ICE check-ins with ICE officers, just to make sure they're following the law, making sure that their case is, going through the system. And people are being arrested when they come in for those check-ins with ICE officers. So they're arresting people who are low-hanging fruit. So I think that's one thing that I hope people understand is that, number one, the immigration system is incredibly complex. We've been working on this topic for how many years, and we don't understand it fully. We need an immigration lawyer to help us with anything. And even immigration lawyers need help to figure things out, especially in this environment where the policy environment and the rules are changing so quickly.
I have never had to respond or work with children with regard to immigration, but I have worked with a lot of adults because I come from the entertainment industry, and there were many people, whether they were models, actors, that wanted to come to the United States. I love what you said earlier about people wanting to come to work. Coming to work is coming to contribute. You're contributing to the overall and the society, to the country. And many of the adults I've known and still know who are dealing with immigration in one way or another, legal immigration, all the processes are still incredibly challenged. It is such a complex issue in our society, our immigration policies and how they're set up. I have a friend recently that, well, not recently, but some years ago, um, was caught up in a U visa situation. A U visa is, I'm not going to get into it now because it's a completely different subject or topic that we can talk about another time. But it was a horrific situation. And in doing research, I learned that there are hundreds of thousands of people in the United States trying to get a U visa, which means that they either have been a part of a crime or they have witnessed a crime, and they're granted this U visa to hold them here in the United States legally so that they can then go to court. And sometimes that U visa is a pathway to citizenship. And that was 10 years ago that I was dealing with that particular situation. And I reference it while it's different from this here. I reference it because it was a mess. And our immigration policies have been a mess. So, what I'm wondering from you is what would compassionate, effective policy actually look like for children and families in this country? Because we are really struggling with how to do what is right for the human being.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because I think we're constantly talking about how to respond to the fires and how to put out all these fires. But it's really important to figure out what we're fighting for and the vision for how children can thrive in this country, right? I think the biggest thing is fixing our immigration system so that we have legal pathways to citizenship. I think there's so many things that we can do to reverse the harms of what we've seen in the past year. There's been revocations of temporary status, such as temporary protected status for certain countries. Having a pathway to citizenship or legal status is incredibly important because that opens up pathways to work permits. It opens up pathways to getting a driver's license. People can participate in society more freely and without fear. And I think that it is an incredible relief for people to know that they aren't going to be thrown into some jail, right? Indefinitely. And speaking of jail, we need to get rid of mandatory detention. There is absolutely no reason why we are jailing 5-year-olds, 2-year-olds, nursing mothers. There's absolutely no reason why we need to jail anybody who is not a public safety threat or somebody who is a threat to themselves.
Can I jump in right there because I really want to put a pin, highlight that holding 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, nursing mothers in a detention center, in a jail system, holding them there for what purpose really? And I mean, you really visualize and really think about and consider that's part of our policy, that we're going to put them in these detention centers to hold them when you know who they are, you can track them, you've notified them, they can still live in the conditions that they're living in while you are exercising your policies. But to extract them and then to jail them, I mean, I think that's really something to consider.
That's maybe the most concrete example that you could think of, or one of many concrete examples that you can, when you're considering this issue, right, of how families, especially families with young children, are being impacted. There's so much research that shows that basically, like any time within a carceral setting, right, it increases mortality rates. It worsens your mental health, or like predisposes you to suffer from mental health challenges. You're exposed to infectious disease, right? And because many of the detention centers that people are being sent to were built so quickly, right? Like not that there's any sort of adequate way to warehouse people, right? But many of the facilities don't have proper sanitation infrastructure. You know, like dozens of people, potentially even hundreds, are being stacked on top of each other, right? People aren't getting proper nutrition. They're not able to sleep. There's so many ways that family detention in general is sort of a microcosm of the cruelty, right, that immigrant families are experiencing under current immigration enforcement.
And this is, and Suma, I didn't mean to interrupt earlier, but this is all inside the United States of America, where we believed in previous years that and generations that this was the complete antithesis of who we are as a society and as a people, and yet this is all pardon me, this is all happening right here in our country, and it's now policy. I mean, it's in many ways, it's just absolutely shocking. For those who are listening and want to help, what would you suggest, or how can they become more informed or involved, or where should they begin if they want to help based on where they are? They're not necessarily experiencing this in their communities, but as we've discussed, as a whole, we are all experiencing it. So, how can those people who want to do more? Because when I'm online in my social media, and I'll sometimes write a poem or spoken word and share that with people. And it sometimes feels like an elixir, right? And it's soothing and it's helping. But people say, I'm scared. I'm afraid. This is scary. So there's a lot of fear, right? Across the nation. So, what would you say for people, specifically this area here, who want to help? What can they do?
Yeah, I totally get that. It is so easy to hear all of this despair and just want to turn it off, right? And I've been avoiding the news too, right? It is too much for me to hear all of that. And it's easy to think that one person can't make a difference, but they really can. I think that's something to really learn and believe in. Um, there's this framework. It's like it's a 3-part Venn diagram of activism that I saw related to climate action. And I'll borrow it, but give credit to Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who created it. But thinking about what brings you joy, what work is needed, and what are you good at? And thinking about what the intersection of all of those are things that you bring to the table. I can give you concrete things that folks can do right now is call their representatives and ask them to pass the Protecting Sensitive Locations Act and the Help Separated Children Act. These are federal bills that protect children and parent rights and protects places of worship, hospitals, schools from immigration enforcement so people can go to these places without fear. And the Help Separated Children Act protects parents in detention and their rights to make decisions about the safety and well-being of the children, of their own minor children. And it also minimizes the harm to children during enforcement actions. In Minneapolis, we heard about a 6-month-old in the crossfire of an ICE raid and getting tear gassed. And that should not happen. We need congressional oversight over ICE. ICE needs to be accountable to public safety. They need to be accountable for human rights. Call your representatives, ask them to support these two bills and ask them to no longer fund immigration enforcement actions that endanger children and separate families.
So use your voice, basically. Use your voice, whether it's making phone calls, whether it's speaking up, becoming informed, use your voice. Lastly, before we close, if you can just offer a highlight, something helpful, what gives you hope as we close out so that we can leave on a high note, not to diminish what we've talked about, but just to balance it out. Where are you hopeful in this process?
My answer to this question is the same to your last one. I think that we can all learn from the folks who are mobilizing and organizing on the ground, right, in places like Minneapolis, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, where there have been really pervasive operations, right, of immigration enforcement, and communities have really come together to support their immigrant neighbors and really push back, both like through grassroots organizing, right, and also by having local government officials, right, like take some of the actions that Suma had just shared.
I would say I get a lot of hope from my nibblings, which is what I call my sister's kids. um, I think seeing the world through their eyes and knowing that there is fascination and awe and amazement with the world that we are still living in, and there is something that is worth fighting for. I think that's what gives me hope.
Well, the late Jesse Jackson always said, keep hope alive. And that's what we do our best to do, to keep hope alive, keep believing, keep sharing, keep talking. Thank you both for joining me today. My thanks to Suma and Kaelin for, I think, a really thoughtful and deeply important conversation. Issues like these can sometimes feel distant, and when discussing politically, it's challenging to understand all the nuances, but it's really important to understand how policy always meets real people, especially children and families. If this conversation moved you or challenged you or informed you, please share it with someone else. This is Rise with Addison Witt. And until next time, you keep rising.
Let me introduce you to an organization called Defense of Democracy. We're a New York-based nonprofit with chapters across the United States. Our mission is to empower pro-democracy movements at a local level with the goal of protecting the Constitution and other foundational American documents. We have a coalition of like-minded organizations, including faith leaders, veterans, and students, and we work to promote democracy, stand up for inclusivity, and fight censorship and book bans in our libraries and education system. Well, for just $5 a month, about the price of one coffee-type beverage, you can support Defense of Democracy's mission, and you can make a difference in your local community and really in the entire nation. That's just $5 a month. I'm going to say that again. Not a day, not a week, $5 a month. One day out of 30, you can brew your coffee at home and stand up for the America that you know and love. So scan this QR code or visit defenseofdemocracy.org today. Put on a pot of coffee. We got work to do.